Three gym bullies corner a 65-year-old black veteran, mocking his heart surgery scars and shoving him against the lockers while making racist jokes. The pack of cowards thinks they've found the perfect victim, an elderly man just trying to get back in shape after bypass surgery. But the quiet stranger in the corner, the one they completely ignored, isn't just another old gym member. This is Steven Seagal himself, and he's been watching every second of their disgusting display. The bullies have no clue they just terrorized a war hero in front of a man who's spent decades perfecting the art of destroying punks exactly like them. While the veteran tries to maintain his dignity, the aikido master moves closer with that deadly calm that's made him a legend. The lead bully keeps running his mouth, thinking his steroid muscles make him untouchable, but he's about to learn why you never mess with America's heroes in front of Steven Seagal. What happens when three gym rats pick the wrong fight with the wrong veteran? Will the bullies survive their lesson in respect? What happened next would terrorize the punks for the rest of their pathetic lives. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Williams stood outside Iron Paradise Gym at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, clutching his doctor's clearance note like a lifeline. The October sun cast harsh shadows across the concrete parking lot, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. 3 months had passed since the bypass surgery that left a fresh scar across his chest, a reminder of mortality that his late wife Eleanor would have called God's way of telling you to slow down, baby. But slowing down wasn't an option. Not when sitting alone in their empty house only amplified the silence where her laughter used to be. The gym's neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an artificial glow through the plate glass windows. Inside, he could see the afternoon crowd, mostly younger people, predominantly white, moving through their routines with the casual confidence of those who'd never questioned their right to occupy any space they chose. Marcus adjusted the strap of his worn gym bag and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The blast of air conditioning hit him immediately, along with the familiar smell of sweat, rubber mats, and something else, testosterone-fueled aggression that seemed to permeate the walls. Hip-hop music pounded from speakers mounted near the ceiling, the bass line vibrating through the floor and into his chest where the surgical wires still ached on humid days. "Help you?" The voice came from behind the front desk, dripping with the kind of false politeness that barely concealed contempt. Brad Kellerman looked like he'd been carved from marble by someone with anger issues. 32 years old, 6'2", with the kind of muscular build that screamed steroids and serious time under the iron. His blonde hair was cut in an expensive style that probably cost more than Marcus spent on groceries in a month, and his cold blue eyes conducted a full assessment in the time it took most people to blink. "I'd like a day pass, please." Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. 20 years in the Army had taught him how to project authority even when he felt anything but authoritative. "You sure you're in the right place, Pops?" Brad's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "We got some pretty serious athletes in here. Might be a little intense for someone your age." Behind Brad, two men flanked the desk like bookends of barely contained violence. Danny Kowalski stood to the left, 6'3", 250 pounds of steroid-enhanced muscle stuffed into a tank top that showcased arms covered in scars from street fights. His buzz-cut and cold gray eyes gave him the look of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists. Rick Martinez occupied the right side, smaller but somehow more dangerous. 5'8" and wiry, he carried himself with the quick movements of a switchblade, compact, sharp, and ready to cut. His dark hair was styled to perfection, and his brown eyes held the kind of cruel intelligence that found other people's weaknesses and stored them away for future use. $15 for a day pass, Brad said finally, after the three men had exchanged looks that carried entire conversations. Marcus pulled out his wallet, worn leather that Eleanor had given him for their 10th anniversary, and counted out the bills. His hands remained steady despite the way the three men watched his every movement like predators evaluating prey. As Marcus headed toward the locker room, he heard the whispered conversation begin behind him. Too quiet to make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. He'd heard it before, in a dozen different situations over 6 decades of being black in America. The main gym floor stretched out before Marcus like a battlefield mapped in chrome and rubber. Rows of weight machines gleamed under fluorescent lights, while free weights lined the walls in perfect military precision. The afternoon crowd moved through their routines with focused intensity. Young professionals grabbing quick workouts between meetings, college students pushing their limits, and serious bodybuilders who treated the gym like a temple. In the far corner, almost invisible among the sea of youth and aggression, a quiet figure moved through his warm-up routine with unusual grace. The man appeared to be in his 70s, dressed in faded gray sweats and worn sneakers that had seen better decades. His silver hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and his weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than sitting behind desks. But it was his movements that caught the eye of anyone trained to recognize such things. Each stretch flowed into the next with liquid precision, his body positioning itself with the unconscious perfection of someone who'd spent decades mastering the relationship between mind, body, and spirit. He moved like water, seemingly effortless, but carrying the potential for devastating power. Marcus made his way to the lightweight section, acutely aware of the 3 sets of eyes tracking his progress. His doctor had been specific about the limitations. Nothing over 10 pounds for the first month, no sudden movements that might stress the surgical site, and immediate cessation of activity if he experienced any chest pain or unusual shortness of breath. He selected a pair of 5-pound dumbbells and found an empty bench, trying to ignore the way conversations seemed to quiet as he passed. The prescribed routine was simple: basic arm curls, gentle shoulder movements, light chest presses. That wouldn't strain the healing incision. "Look at that." Danny's voice carried clearly across the gym floor, pitched just loud enough to be heard without seeming deliberately confrontational. "Guess they're really lowering the standards around here." A few other gym members glanced over, some with curiosity, others with the carefully neutral expressions of people who'd learned not to get involved in other people's problems. Marcus continued his routine, counting repetitions in his head the way he'd counted steps on endless military marches. "Maybe we should call an ambulance now," Rick added with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Save time later when Grandpa has his heart attack." The ponytailed stranger in the corner never paused in his stretching routine, but something subtle changed in his posture. His movements became more controlled, more precise, as if he were preparing for something that required absolute readiness. Marcus finished his first set and moved to the next exercise: light shoulder presses that made his chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with the surgery. The whispered comments continued, growing bolder with each passing minute. Insurance liability with elderly members. Brad's voice drifted over from the front desk, where he'd positioned himself for optimal viewing. Probably should have made him sign extra waivers. The mysterious older man had moved closer, seemingly by coincidence, positioning himself at a weight rack that provided clear sight lines to both Marcus and the 3 troublemakers. His stretching routine continued without interruption, but anyone trained in tactical awareness would have recognized the change. He was no longer exercising, he was preparing. Marcus felt his heart rate climbing, and not from the gentle exercise. The stress was triggering exactly the kind of response his cardiologist had warned him about: the fight-or-flight reaction that could put dangerous strain on his healing cardiovascular system. The harassment escalated with the methodical precision of a military campaign designed to break an enemy's will without providing grounds for official complaint. Marcus had seen similar tactics during his army service: psychological warfare that stayed just inside the boundaries of plausible deniability while inflicting maximum damage to the target's morale. Danny led the assault, timing his movements to coincide with Marcus's exercises. As Marcus moved to the leg press machine, Danny accidentally walked too close during his approach, forcing the older man to pause mid-stride and step back. "Oops, sorry, Grandpa. Didn't see you there," Danny said with mock sincerity, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby gym members. The collision sent Marcus's water bottle flying across the rubberized floor, where it rolled under a rack of dumbbells. A few people glanced over, but quickly looked away when they caught sight of Danny's intimidating bulk and cold gray eyes. The message was clear: this wasn't a place where good Samaritans were welcome. Marcus retrieved his water bottle without complaint, maintaining the disciplined silence that had served him well during decades of military service. But the stress was taking its toll. His chest tightened with each incident, and he found himself checking his pulse more frequently, conscious of the surgical wires still healing inside his ribcage. Rick took a different approach, preferring psychological warfare to physical intimidation. He positioned himself at the sound system controls, cranking up hip-hop music with explicit lyrics while making loud comments about certain people and their music preferences. When Marcus moved to the exercise bikes, Rick appeared nearby with theatrical timing. "Interesting choice," Rick said, loud enough for others to hear. "Most welfare recipients stick to walking. Guess food stamps by more than they used to." The racial undertone was unmistakable, delivered with the kind of smiling malice that made official complaints difficult to pursue. A few gym members shifted, uncomfortably, but none made eye contact or offered support. The three bullies had created an atmosphere where intervention seemed not just unwelcome, but potentially dangerous. Meanwhile, the mysterious older man continued his routine with increasing intensity. His stretching had evolved into more complex movements, fluid forms that suggested decades of martial arts training. To casual observers, he appeared to be conducting an elaborate warm-up routine, but anyone with combat experience would have recognized the signs. He was preparing his body for violence. His positioning had become strategic rather than coincidental. Each movement placed him closer to the developing confrontation while maintaining the appearance of random gym usage. His gray sweats and worn sneakers made him nearly invisible among the younger, flashier crowd, but his presence cast a shadow of potential consequence over the bullies' escalating aggression. Brad observed from his position behind the front desk, orchestrating the harassment with the casual authority of a man accustomed to having his will enforced through surrogate violence. He caught Marcus's eye and smiled, a cold expression that carried decades of practiced cruelty. The ponytailed stranger noticed everything. His movements became more controlled, more precise, as if he were channeling rising anger into focused preparation. He selected a position near the free weights that provided clear lines of movement to any point on the gym floor, his body language shifting from casual exercise to predatory alertness. Rick made his boldest move yet, delivering his first openly racist comment, a joke about certain neighborhoods and government assistance programs, pitched just loud enough for Marcus to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. To any potential witnesses, Marcus straightened slowly, his military bearing asserting itself despite the physical and emotional stress. For the first time since entering the gym, he made direct eye contact with his tormentor, his brown eyes carrying the weight of 2 decades of military service and 65 years of dignity maintained in the face of systematic disrespect. Marcus retreated to the locker room, seeking a moment of privacy to check his heart rate and regain his composure. The stress of the confrontation had triggered warning signs his cardiologist had specifically cautioned him about: elevated pulse, chest tightness, and the kind of adrenaline surge that could strain his healing cardiovascular system beyond safe limits. He sat on the wooden bench where he'd changed clothes less than an hour ago, pressing 2 fingers to his wrist and counting heartbeats while breathing deeply through his nose. The rhythm was elevated but not dangerously so, though the tightness in his chest served as a constant reminder of how quickly his situation could turn from uncomfortable to life-threatening. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the tile walls, heavy boots and casual sneakers moving with the coordinated precision of a pack that had done this before. Marcus looked up as 3 figures filled the doorway, blocking his exit with practiced intimidation tactics. Brad entered first, his muscular frame filling the entrance while Danny and Rick flanked him like bookends of barely contained violence. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across their faces, emphasizing the cold calculation in their eyes as they surrounded their target in the confined space. "Look, old man," Brad began, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. This is a serious gym for serious athletes. The YMCA has programs for people like you, senior citizens, cardiac patients, people on fixed incomes." Each phrase was carefully chosen, layered with multiple levels of discrimination while maintaining enough surface respectability to deflect formal complaints. Marcus recognized the technique from his military intelligence training, psychological warfare designed to demoralize without providing actionable evidence of misconduct. I paid my fee like everyone else, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. I have every right to be here. Brad's manufactured smile slipped, revealing the ugly reality beneath the facade. Don't get smart with me, boy. People like you need to know their place. The racial slur hung in the air like poison, transforming the encounter from harassment into something far more dangerous. Danny stepped closer, using his 6'3", 250-pound frame to create an atmosphere of physical menace. Rick positioned himself to cut off any escape attempt, his wiry frame coiled with the potential energy of a switchblade ready to spring. Marcus stood slowly, drawing upon 20 years of military bearing and 65 years of dignity maintained in the face of systematic oppression. At 5'10", he was smaller than Danny but carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in life-or-death situations. I served this country for 20 years, son, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in uniform. I earned my place anywhere I choose to be. The words struck like a physical blow, causing all 3 men to stiffen with anger. The revelation that their target was a military veteran threatened to undermine their entire narrative of justified harassment. I don't give a damn what you used to be, Brad snarled, his careful facade cracking completely. This is my gym, and I decide who belongs here. Gentlemen, I think you owe this man an apology. The voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm, measured, but carrying unmistakable authority that made everyone in the room freeze. It came from the doorway where a figure now stood, his presence somehow making the spacious locker room feel smaller and more dangerous. The ponytailed stranger from the gym floor filled the entrance, but something fundamental had changed in his bearing. Gone was the casual anonymity of gray sweats and worn sneakers. In its place stood a predator of such obvious lethality that the very air seemed to thicken around him. Steven Seagal stepped into the locker room with the fluid grace of a predator, claiming territory. His presence transformed the confined space from a site of intimidation into something far more dangerous. A trap where 3 bullies had just discovered they were no longer the apex predators. Brad attempted to bluster his way through the interruption, his voice cracking slightly despite his efforts to project authority. Mind your own business, Grandpa. This doesn't concern you. But something in Seagal's dark eyes, a stillness that spoke of violence refined to the level of art, made Brad take an involuntary step backward. The older man's weathered face remained impassive, but his body language had shifted into something that made the air itself seem heavier with potential consequences. Danny was the first to recognize him, his steroid-enhanced confidence evaporating like water on hot steel. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. Holy shit, that's Steven Seagal. The name hit the room like a thunderbolt, transforming the atmosphere from predatory confidence to something approaching genuine terror. Rick's perpetual smirk vanished instantly, replaced by the wide-eyed expression of someone who'd just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff. His cruel intelligence, so effective against elderly victims, proved useless in calculating odds against a legend. Brad's face cycled through several shades of pale as the implications sank in. The muscular gym owner who'd built his reputation on intimidating the vulnerable suddenly found himself face-to-face with someone who'd spent decades dismantling bullies exactly like him. His expensive haircut and steroid-enhanced physique seemed pathetically inadequate against the quiet authority radiating from the man in gray sweats. Look, we were just having a conversation, Brad stammered, his voice rising an octave as he gestured weakly toward Marcus. No need for anyone to get excited here. Just a misunderstanding between gym members. Seagal moved deeper into the room, with movements that seemed casual but carried the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime perfecting the relationship between thought and deadly action. He positioned himself between the 3 bullies and Marcus with the fluid efficiency of water finding its level, his hands loose at his sides, but ready for violence that would be swift, precise, and absolutely final. Age and treachery will always overcome youth and skill, Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades proving that truth in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But wisdom trumps them all. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise simultaneously. Danny's hands, which had been clenched into fists moments earlier, now hung uselessly at his sides as he contemplated the reality of facing someone whose reputation was built on destroying men exactly like him. Rick pressed himself against the lockers, his switchblade quickness suddenly seeming inadequate against an opponent who moved like liquid death. Brad made the critical error that would define the next 30 seconds of his life. Desperation overrode intelligence as he reached out to grab Seagal's shoulder, his hand moving with the clumsy aggression of someone who'd never faced genuine opposition. "I said this doesn't concern." His sentence ended in a strangled gasp, as Seagal's hand moved like striking lightning, intercepting the grab with movements too fast for the human eye to properly track. The lesson in humility was about to begin. Seagal's right hand moved with the devastating precision of a master craftsman, intercepting Brad's clumsy grab and applying an aikido wrist control technique that transformed the gym owner's aggression into his own destruction. The joint lock was applied with surgical accuracy, dropping Brad to his knees with a strangled cry that echoed off the tile walls. The beauty of aikido revealed itself in that moment. Brad's own force, redirected through superior technique, became the instrument of his downfall. Seagal barely seemed to move, yet the larger man found himself trapped in a position where the slightest resistance would result in a broken wrist. The steroid-enhanced muscles that had intimidated countless victims proved useless against leverage, applied by someone who understood the human body's mechanical vulnerabilities. Danny lunged forward with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, his 250 pounds of enhanced muscle driving towards Seagal like a freight train. But the martial arts legend had anticipated the attack, positioning himself to use the confined space and Danny's own momentum against him. The Irimi Nage throw was executed with textbook perfection. Seagal stepped into Danny's charge, blending with his movement while redirecting the kinetic energy in a graceful spiral that sent the massive enforcer airborne. Danny's bulk, which had served him so well in intimidating the weak, became a liability. As he crashed into the metal lockers with bone-jarring impact, the sound of his body hitting steel reverberated through the room like thunder. Rick tried to circle behind Seagal, his wiry frame moving with the quick desperation of someone who'd built his reputation on avoiding fair fights. But there was nowhere to hide in the confined space, and Seagal's tactical awareness encompassed every angle of approach. Without even turning around, the master struck with a precise finger technique to a pressure point on Rick's neck. The smaller man dropped instantly, his nervous system overwhelmed by the perfectly placed strike. His cruel intelligence, so effective at finding psychological weaknesses in elderly victims, proved worthless against an opponent who could shut down his body's basic functions with casual ease. Brad remained trapped in the wrist control, whimpering, as Seagal applied just enough pressure to demonstrate the complete hopelessness of his situation. The gym owner's face had gone white with pain and the dawning realization that all his advantages, youth, size, numerical superiority, meant nothing against superior skill and decades of experience. Aikido teaches us that true strength protects the weak, Seagal explained calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a lecture rather than dominating three opponents simultaneously. Violence should only meet violence, and then only with the minimum force necessary to restore balance. He released Brad, who collapsed holding his wrist and staring up at the legend with a mixture of pain, terror, and grudging respect. Danny groaned against the lockers, his steroid-enhanced bulk proving inadequate protection against the unforgiving metal. Rick lay unconscious, his body having simply shut down under the precise application of pressure point techniques. The entire sequence had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it had fundamentally altered the power dynamic that had governed this gym for months. Three men who'd built their reputation on preying upon the vulnerable had been systematically dismantled by someone who represented everything they'd never understood about true strength. Seagal turned to Marcus, his expression shifting from predatory focus to genuine concern. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood the dignity required to survive decades of systematic disrespect. Marcus shook his head, still processing the speed and efficiency with which justice had been delivered. But his Expression suggested that this incident was part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple gym confrontation. Seagal helped Marcus gather his belongings while the three bullies writhed on the locker room floor. Their reign of intimidation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Danny groaned against the dented lockers. His steroid-enhanced frame folded in a way that suggested several ribs had become intimately acquainted with unforgiving metal. Rick remained unconscious, his body's nervous system still recovering from the precisely applied pressure point strike. Brad clutched his wrist, staring at Seagal with the wide-eyed expression of someone who'd just discovered that legends were real and personally invested in justice. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" Seagal asked again, his voice carrying genuine concern as he observed Marcus's careful movements. The older man's military bearing remained intact, but Seagal's trained eye could detect the subtle signs of stress-induced cardiovascular strain that could prove dangerous for someone recovering from recent surgery. "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though his breathing remained slightly elevated and his hands showed the tremor that came from adrenaline slowly leaving his system. "Thank you" doesn't seem adequate for what you just did. As they prepared to leave the locker room, Marcus hesitated at the doorway. His expression carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying a burden alone for too long, and Seagal's intervention had created an opening for truths that needed to be shared. "Mr. Seagal," Marcus began, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "There's something you need to know. This isn't just about the gym." They walked toward the parking lot, leaving behind the fluorescent lights and artificial atmosphere of Iron Paradise for the honest sunshine of late afternoon. Other gym members watched through the windows as the legend and the veteran moved. Together, their body language suggesting a conversation of significant importance. "These men," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the suppressed anger of someone who'd witnessed systematic injustice. "They've been terrorizing our entire neighborhood. For months. Elderly people, minorities, small business owners. Anyone they see is vulnerable. What happened in there was just the tip of the iceberg." Seagal listened with the focused attention of someone trained to extract intelligence from complex situations. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected the growing understanding that this afternoon's confrontation was merely the visible symptom of a much larger disease. "They run a protection racket," Marcus explained, his military background providing the precise terminology for what many victims could only describe as generalized fear. "Demanding money from store owners, threatening families who refuse to pay, vandalizing properties that don't comply with their demands." The picture Marcus painted was one of systematic predation designed to extract maximum profit from the community's most vulnerable residents. The gym served as both a front for legitimacy and a recruitment center for the kind of muscle that made their threats credible. "The police won't listen," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd tried official channels without success. "These guys have connections, city councilmen, fire inspectors, people who can make reports disappear and witnesses afraid to come forward." Seagal's expression darkened as the scope of the corruption became clear. What had begun as a simple intervention against gym bullies was revealing itself as something far more serious. A criminal enterprise protected by institutional corruption and designed to prey upon those least able to defend themselves. Marcus stopped beside his old Toyota Camry, its faded paint and careful maintenance telling the story of someone who'd learned to make things last through necessity rather than choice. He turned to face Seagal directly, his brown eyes carrying decades of dignity maintained in the face of systematic disrespect. "I've been trying to gather evidence for months," Marcus admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But nobody believes. An old black man against three white guys with city connections. Until today, I thought I was fighting this alone." The weight of isolation in his voice spoke to something deeper than the afternoon's harassment. It revealed a man who'd been carrying the burden of an entire community's suffering while facing the systematic dismissal that came with being elderly, black, and economically vulnerable in a system designed to ignore such combinations. "You're not alone anymore," Seagal said simply, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd spent decades turning the tide in seemingly hopeless situations. Marcus looked at him with growing hope, recognizing the sincerity behind the pledge and the capability to make good on such promises. "But if we're going to stop this," Seagal continued, his tactical mind already shifting into operational planning mode. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The scope, the players, the connections that keep them protected. Marcus's expression shifted from relief to anticipation as he realized that his months of solitary investigation might finally have found the partner it needed to become effective action. He reached into his car, retrieving a thick manila folder that had been residing on his passenger seat like a constant reminder of unfinished business. "I'm not just a random victim, Mr. Seagal," Marcus began, his voice carrying a note of professional pride. "I'm a retired Army CID investigator. Criminal Investigation Division. I've been conducting systematic surveillance for 3 months." The revelation transformed Seagal's perception of the man beside him. What he'd initially seen as a dignified victim of harassment was revealing itself as a trained investigator who'd been building a case with professional methodology. The folder Marcus handed him contained the kind of evidence that spoke to decades of experience in gathering intelligence and building prosecutable cases. "It started when they threatened my neighbor, Dorothy Chun," Marcus explained, opening the folder to reveal photographs, recorded conversations, and meticulously documented financial records. "She's a 78-year-old widow who owns a small convenience store. They demanded $500 a month for protection services." Seagal examined the contents with professional appreciation. Marcus had compiled surveillance photos showing money exchanges, recorded phone conversations containing explicit threats, witness testimonies from frightened victims, and financial documentation that tracked the bullies' growing wealth through systematic extortion. "This is excellent work," Seagal acknowledged, his respect for Marcus's capabilities evident in his tone. "You've documented a pattern that goes far beyond simple harassment. This is organized crime." The evidence revealed a sophisticated operation that targeted the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents first, used escalating intimidation to break down resistance, then leveraged fear to expand their territory systematically. Brad's crew had identified the perfect victims: elderly residents on fixed incomes, minority business owners reluctant to involve police, and anyone else whose complaints could be easily dismissed by corrupt officials. "They're not just criminals," Seagal observed, studying photographs that showed the bullies' casual confidence during their collection rounds. "They're psychological terrorists. They've created an atmosphere where people are afraid to leave their houses, afraid to open their businesses, afraid to live normal lives." Marcus nodded grimly, his investigation having revealed the true scope of the damage being inflicted on his community. The financial extortion was devastating enough, but the psychological impact was destroying the social fabric that held neighborhoods together. "I've got testimonies from 8 different business owners," Marcus continued, pulling out additional documentation. Photos of vandalism that mysteriously never gets investigated. Recordings of threatening phone calls that the police claim they can't trace. Financial records showing these guys have made over $200,000 in the past year. The numbers spoke to both the scope of the operation and the systematic nature of its protection. This wasn't random street crime, it was organized extortion operating under official protection, which meant the corruption extended far beyond 3 gym bullies. "Tomorrow I'm meeting with Dorothy Chin again," Marcus said, pointing to a red circle on his neighborhood map. "She received another threat yesterday, and this time they mentioned her grandson Kevin. I think they're ready to escalate to violence." Seagal studied the map, his tactical mind already beginning to formulate responses to the various scenarios such escalation might produce. The transition from financial extortion to physical violence represented a critical threshold that could quickly spiral into something far more dangerous. "Then tomorrow," Seagal said quietly, "we turn defense into offense." 1 hour later, Marcus unlocked the door to his modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, the familiar creak of the hinges providing a stark contrast to the afternoon's violence. Photos of his late wife, Eleanor, lined the hallway: their wedding day, military promotions, quiet moments of happiness that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. The house carried the particular silence of spaces where laughter had once lived but would never return. Marcus led Seagal to the dining room, which had been transformed into something resembling a military intelligence center. Maps covered every surface, with colored pins marking locations of extortion victims, documented incidents, and suspected safe houses. Photographs lined the walls, surveillance shots of money exchanges, vandalized storefronts, and the faces of victims too frightened to seek official help. 3 months of work, Marcus said, spreading additional files across the table. Every conversation recorded, every incident documented, every financial transaction tracked. Seagal examined the evidence with professional appreciation, recognizing the methodical approach of someone trained in building prosecutable cases. Marcus had compiled surveillance photos showing Brad's crew conducting their collection rounds with clockwork precision, recorded phone conversations containing explicit threats against business owners, and financial documentation that tracked unexplained wealth accumulation. The pattern emerges clearly, Marcus explained, pointing to a timeline chart that showed the operation's systematic expansion. They started small, targeting elderly homeowners for security services. When nobody complained, they moved to minority-owned businesses. Now they're demanding tribute from anyone they consider vulnerable. The intelligence revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that identified victims through careful reconnaissance, applied psychological pressure before escalating to financial demands, and used the threat of violence to maintain compliance. Brad's gym served as both operational headquarters and recruitment center for the muscle necessary to make their threats credible. Dorothy Chun was their test case, Marcus continued, pulling out a thick subfolder dedicated to his neighbors. Situation: 78 years old, immigrant, small business owner with limited English. Perfect victim from their perspective. Seagal studied photographs of Chin's Corner Market, a small convenience store clearly struggling to survive. The documentation showed a systematic campaign of intimidation. Broken windows attributed to accidents, inventory mysteriously spoiled, and spray-painted threats in languages that made reporting difficult for someone whose English remained limited despite decades. In America, $500 monthly, Marcus said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd witnessed systematic injustice. More than her profit margin. They're literally bleeding her business to death while threatening to hurt her grandson if she stops paying. The files revealed 12 documented victims across a 6-block radius, with extortion demands ranging from $300 to $800 monthly. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the financial drain. Elderly residents, afraid to leave their houses, business owners considering closing rather than facing continued harassment. The police response? Seagal asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Reports filed, nothing investigated. Marcus replied grimly. Detective Morrison claims they don't have resources for neighborhood disputes. Captain Rodriguez suggests victims are overreacting to normal business negotiations. Meanwhile, Brad's crew operates in broad daylight. The systematic dismissal of complaints revealed corruption extending far beyond street-level extortion. This was institutional protection allowing criminal enterprises to flourish while victims remained isolated and helpless. Tomorrow's meeting with Dorothy is crucial, Marcus concluded. She's received another threat, specifically mentioning Kevin. I think they're ready to escalate to violence, which means we're running out of time to stop this through evidence gathering. The next morning at 9 a.m., Marcus and Seagal approached Chin's Corner Market through the crisp October air. The small convenience store occupied the corner of 2 residential streets, its faded awning and hand-painted signs speaking to decades of careful maintenance by someone who'd built a life through honest work and stubborn perseverance. Dorothy Chin stood barely 5 feet tall behind the counter, her slight frame dwarfed by the cash register and displays of everyday necessities that represented her American dream. At 78, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been worn down by decades of 16-hour workdays, but her dark eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had carried her through immigration, widowhood, and the daily challenges of small business ownership. Mrs. Chun, Marcus said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship. This is the man I told you about. He wants to help. Dorothy's weathered hands trembled slightly as she looked up at Seagal, her expression cycling through hope, fear, and the kind of wariness that came from months of systematic intimidation. Her limited English became even more careful under stress, each word chosen with the precision of someone who'd learned that miscommunication could have dangerous consequences. They come yesterday, she said quietly, glancing toward the front. windows as if expecting to see Brad's crew materializing from the morning shadows. Say Kevin. They hurt Kevin if I talk to police. Say they know where he go to school, where he work. Seagal listened with the focused attention of someone trained to extract intelligence from frightened witnesses. His presence seemed to fill the small store, not with intimidation, but with the kind of protective authority that made victims feel safe enough to reveal truths they'd been hiding. Show him, Marcus encouraged gently. Show him what they did. Last week, Dorothy led them to the front window, where hastily applied duct tape covered a spider web of cracks in the glass. The repair job spoke to someone operating on the thinnest possible margins, unable to afford professional replacement but refusing to let the damage remain visible to the community. They say accident, Dorothy explained, her voice carrying the bitter understanding of someone who'd learned that official explanations often bore no relationship to actual truth. But Rick, he throw bottle at window when I 2 days late with money. Then Danny, he come inside, knock down things, say next. Time maybe fire start by accident. The pattern of escalation was textbook intimidation, property damage attributed to accidents, followed by implicit threats about more serious accidents that might occur if compliance wasn't maintained. The psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical assault, creating an atmosphere where victims lived in constant fear of when the next escalation would occur. Seagal examined the damaged merchandise that Dorothy had carefully res-tacked on the shelves, products that had been accidentally knocked to the floor during Danny's visit. The systematic nature of the destruction spoke to calculated intimidation, rather than random vandalism. How much? Seagal asked quietly. 800 now, Dorothy whispered, the number carrying the weight of impossible mathematics. They say prices go up, inflation, they need more money for protection. But store, it make maybe 600 profit good month. The arithmetic of extortion was designed to be unsustainable, forcing victims into impossible choices between financial ruin and physical safety. Dorothy's situation represented the perfect trap: pay and eventually lose the business through bankruptcy, or refuse and face escalating violence against herself and her family. As they prepared to leave, Seagal noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its occupants clearly observing the store through telephoto lenses. The surveillance was professional but obvious, designed to send a message about the consequences of seeking outside help. Mrs. Chun, Seagal said quietly, do you recognize that car? Dorothy's face went pale as she followed his gaze, her hands beginning to shake visibly. They hear. They watching. Please, you must go. If they see you talking to me. The fear in her voice spoke to months of conditioning, where any deviation from expected behavior had been met with swift and escalating consequences. The black sedan represented more than surveillance. It was a promise of retribution for anyone who dared to seek help. Seagal and Marcus quickly exited through the store's rear entrance as the black sedan's occupants, Danny and Rick, climbed out and approached the front door. The alley behind Chen's Corner Market provided concealment while allowing them to observe the intimidation tactics being employed in broad daylight. Through the store's rear window, they watched Danny's hulking frame fill the doorway while Rick positioned himself to block any escape attempt. Dorothy's small figure seemed to shrink even further as the two enforcers surrounded her behind the counter, their body language radiating the casual menace of predators who'd never faced serious opposition. Professional intimidation, Seagal observed quietly, noting the practiced coordination between the two men. They've done this enough times to have it down to a system. Danny's scarred hands gestured aggressively, while Rick's cruel smile delivered whatever psychological warfare they'd prepared for this visit. Dorothy reached beneath the counter with shaking hands, retrieving an envelope that clearly contained the monthly tribute demanded for her continued existence in the neighborhood she'd called home for 15 years. The exchange lasted exactly 3 minutes, long enough to collect the money and deliver whatever additional threats were necessary to maintain compliance, but brief enough to avoid attracting attention from potential witnesses. Marcus photographed the license plate, while Seagal documented the systematic nature of the collection process. This is happening in broad daylight, Marcus said grimly, watching Rick count the bills with theatrical precision. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. The brazenness spoke to confidence born of systematic protection. Brad's crew operated with the assurance of criminals who'd learned that official channels would ignore their activities while victims remained isolated and helpless. As Danny and Rick completed their business and returned to the sedan, Seagal's investigation instincts kicked into high gear. We follow them, he decided. Document the full scope of their collection route. The surveillance revealed the true extent of the operation. Their next stop was Santos Family Restaurant, where the same intimidation ritual played out with Miguel Santos, a middle-aged immigrant whose family had operated their small business for over a decade. The elderly proprietor handed over his envelope with the defeated resignation of someone who'd learned that resistance only brought escalation. A third stop at Kim's Alterations showed Seagal and Marcus the systematic nature of the extortion network. Mrs. Kim, a 70-year-old seamstress, provided her tribute with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been conditioned to view the payment as inevitable as rent or utilities. 8 businesses minimum, Marcus counted, tracking their route on his neighborhood map. Conservative estimate of $4,000 monthly in tribute, multiplied by however long this has been operating. The mathematics revealed an operation generating substantial income while flying completely under official radar. Brad's crew had identified the perfect victims: immigrants reluctant to involve authorities, elderly residents on fixed incomes who couldn't afford legal representation, and small business owners whose complaints could be easily dismissed by corrupt officials. The protection goes beyond street level, Seagal observed, watching the casual confidence with which Danny and Rick conducted their collections. This kind of systematic operation requires official cover. Back at Marcus's house, they spread out the day's intelligence alongside the existing evidence. The surveillance had revealed not just the scope of the criminal enterprise, but the systematic nature of its protection from official scrutiny. Councilman Torino, Marcus said, pointing to a photograph of a well-dressed man in an expensive suit. He shows up at the gym after hours, always with bodyguards, always carrying briefcases that leave lighter than they arrived. The political connection explained the systematic dismissal of victim complaints and the confident operation of street-level extortion. City Councilman Robert Torino provided the institutional protection that allowed Brad's crew to operate as if they were conducting legitimate business rather than criminal enterprise. We need to document that connection, Seagal decided. Hard evidence of money changing hands between the street crew and their political protection. Marcus nodded, his military training recognizing the tactical shift from defensive intelligence gathering to offensive operations planning. Tonight, he said, Torino meets with Brad every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Always the same routine, always the same briefcase exchange. The investigation was about to become significantly more dangerous, but the systematic nature of the corruption demanded proportional response. 3 months of patient evidence gathering had revealed a criminal network that would only be stopped through direct action rather than official channels. That evening at 7 p.m., Seagal and Marcus positioned their surveillance vehicle with clear sightlines to Iron Paradise Gym's rear entrance. The parking lot was nearly empty, the afternoon crowd having departed for dinner and family obligations, leaving only the dedicated bodybuilders who treated the gym as a second home. City Councilman Robert "Bobby" Torino arrived precisely at 8 o'clock in a black Mercedes that probably cost more than most neighborhood residents earned in 2 years. His expensive suit and political smile spoke to someone who'd learned to project success and respectability while conducting business that would destroy careers and end in federal prosecution if properly documented. 2 bodyguards flanked Torino as he approached the gym's rear entrance, professional muscle who carried themselves with the disciplined awareness of men accustomed to protecting valuable assets in dangerous situations. Their presence elevated the evening's surveillance from simple intelligence gathering to a potentially lethal encounter if their operational security was compromised. Brad, Danny, and Rick waited inside with the deferential respect of subordinates greeting their superior. Through telephoto lenses and directional microphones, Seagal and Marcus captured fragments of conversation that revealed the true scope of the corruption protecting the neighborhood extortion scheme. Expansion territory, Torino's voice carried clearly through the surveillance equipment. Senior Center District shows potential for significant revenue enhancement. Elderly residents, fixed incomes, minimal resistance expected. The clinical language couldn't disguise the evil being discussed: systematic targeting of the community's most vulnerable residents for financial exploitation. Torino spoke about human suffering with the casual detachment of someone discussing quarterly profit projections. Police response contained, Brad reported, his voice carrying the confidence of someone operating under official protection. Captain Rodriguez confirms his people will classify complaints as civil disputes. No criminal investigations initiated. The corruption extended through multiple levels of city government, creating a protective umbrella that allowed street-level extortion to operate with impunity. Victim complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, while the criminal enterprise expanded its territory and increased its demands. Money changed hands with business-like efficiency. Thick envelopes passed from Brad to Torino while percentage calculations were discussed with the precision of legitimate financial planning. The councilman's cut was substantial enough to ensure continued protection while leaving sufficient profit to motivate the street crew's continued expansion. Insurance opportunities. Torino continued, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone who'd identified new revenue streams. Strategic property fires, electrical system failures, unfortunate accidents that trigger significant payouts. The conversation revealed plans extending far beyond simple extortion into insurance fraud involving accidental fires that would kill elderly residents while generating massive financial returns. The casual discussion of mass murder spoke to criminals who'd moved beyond simple greed into territory that demanded immediate intervention. Seagal photographed everything while Marcus recorded the audio that would provide federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of systematic corruption. The intelligence they were gathering would dismantle not just Brad's street crew, but the entire network of official protection that enabled their crimes. Timeline accelerated. Torino announced as the meeting concluded. Friday evening operation. At Senior Center. Electrical fire during weekly bingo game. Maximum occupancy, minimal survival expected. The words hit like physical blows, transforming their surveillance from intelligence gathering into a race against time. Friday evening was 3 days away, 72 hours to prevent mass murder disguised as accidental fire. As Torino's Mercedes disappeared into the night, Seagal and Marcus sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The neighborhood extortion scheme had been evil enough, but the planned arson represented wholesale slaughter of innocent elderly residents for insurance profit. 40 people, Marcus whispered, his voice carrying the horror of someone who'd just learned that his Friday night bingo friends were targeted for murder. Maybe 50 seniors who attend that weekly game. They're planning to burn them alive. The investigation had revealed corruption extending far beyond anything they'd imagined, with a timeline that left no opportunity for official channels or proper legal procedures. Justice would have to be delivered personally, immediately, and with the kind of finality that ensured no innocent lives would be lost to the monsters masquerading as businessmen and public servants. At 11:30 p.m., Marcus jolted awake to the sound of breaking glass echoing through his modest home like gunshots in the darkness. His military instincts kicked in immediately, 20 years of training overriding the disorientation of deep sleep as he rolled out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat he'd kept beside his nightstand since Eleanor's death. The sounds coming from his living room were deliberate and systematic, furniture being overturned, papers scattered, the methodical destruction of someone searching for specific items while sending a clear message about the consequences of cooperation with outside investigators. Marcus crept toward the hallway, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floors that Eleanor had insisted on refinishing during their last spring together. 6 men had broken into his house through the front and back doors simultaneously, their coordination speaking to professional planning rather than random vandalism. Danny and Rick directed the operation while 4 additional thugs, hired muscle with the dead eyes of men who'd learned to inflict violence without emotional investment, systematically destroyed 3 months of careful investigation. Marcus's dining room intelligence center was their primary target. Maps were torn from walls, photographs scattered across the floor and trampled underfoot, witness statements reduced to confetti by hands that showed no respect for the courage required to provide testimony against dangerous criminals. The systematic destruction spoke to intimate knowledge of what evidence had been gathered and where it was stored. Find the old man. Danny's voice carried clearly through the house. Boss wants him to understand what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong. Marcus retreated to the kitchen and used his cell phone to call Seagal, whispering urgently into the device while keeping watch on the hallway that led to his current position. They're here. 6 men, professional operation. They're destroying everything we gathered. Seagal, staying at a nearby motel after their surveillance operation, arrived within 4 minutes to find Marcus's house under siege. The sound of breaking furniture and violent cursing filled the night air while neighbors' lights remained conspicuously dark, the kind of deliberate blindness that communities developed when criminal enterprises operated with official protection. The battle that followed showcased Seagal's mastery of environmental combat. Using Marcus's furniture and the confined space to his advantage, he systematically dismantled all 6 attackers with aikido throws, improvised weapons, and the kind of precise violence that ended threats without causing permanent disability. A kitchen knife became a throwing weapon that pinned one thug's sleeve to the wall. The coffee table transformed into both shield and battering ram, redirecting attacks while delivering devastating counterstrikes. The narrow hallway became a tactical funnel that prevented the attackers from using their numerical advantage while allowing Seagal to engage them individually. Danny's steroid-enhanced strength proved useless when Seagal used his own momentum against him, redirecting a powerful punch into the refrigerator door with enough force to leave a permanent dent. Rick's switchblade quickness meant nothing when facing someone who could read attacks before they fully developed, intercepting the smaller man's strikes and countering with pressure point techniques that left him unconscious on the kitchen floor. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, but the house bore the scars of systematic destruction. Marcus's months of patient investigation lay in ruins. Photographs torn, recordings destroyed, witness statements reduced to illegible fragments scattered across rooms that had once represented hope for justice. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Marcus's face showed horror rather than relief. "While we were fighting here," he said grimly, "where was Brad? This was a distraction. What was the real target?" The phone rang at 12:45 a.m., its shrill tone cutting through the aftermath of violence like a knife through silence. Dorothy Chen's terrified voice crackled through the speaker, barely coherent through sobs that spoke to trauma beyond simple fear. "They took Kevin," she gasped, her limited English fragmenting under the weight of maternal terror. "They hurt him bad and took him. Hospitals say maybe he don't wake up." Racing through empty streets toward Metropolitan General Hospital, Seagal and Marcus processed the tactical brilliance of their enemy's coordinated attack. While 6 men had destroyed evidence at Marcus's house, Brad had used the distraction to send his own message, a brutal demonstration of the consequences faced by anyone who dared to cooperate with investigators. The hospital's emergency room buzzed with late-night trauma cases, but Kevin Chin's condition had earned him priority treatment in the intensive care unit. Dorothy sat beside his bed, her small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment keeping her grandson alive, her weathered hands clutching his motionless fingers with desperate hope. Kevin's 19-year-old face was barely recognizable beneath bandages and swelling that spoke to systematic, prolonged violence. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and traumatic brain injury had reduced a promising college student to a broken figure surrounded by machines that monitored his tenuous connection to life. "They bring him to store at midnight," Dorothy whispered, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd witnessed evil beyond her capacity to process. 3 men, baseball bats. "They say this would happen to people who talk to investigators. They say next time it be me." The brutality served multiple purposes: punishment for past cooperation, warning against future testimony, and demonstration to the broader community that seeking help brought consequences far worse than simple compliance. Kevin's broken body was intended as a billboard advertising the price of resistance. Marcus felt his chest tighten with the familiar pain that accompanied extreme stress, his recent cardiac surgery making him vulnerable to the kind of emotional trauma that could trigger dangerous arrhythmias. But his military training overrode physical limitations as he studied the systematic nature of the violence inflicted on an innocent young man whose only crime had been helping his grandmother maintain her small business. Seagal's calm demeanor cracked for the first time since Marcus had met him, revealing cold fury beneath the philosophical exterior that had carried him through decades of confronting evil. His hands remained steady, but his dark eyes reflected the kind of controlled rage that preceded devastating retribution. They said if you don't stop investigating, they kill him. Dorothy continued, her voice breaking completely. They said they burned down store with me inside. Friday night bingo game. They said that when everything end if you don't stop. The timeline connected directly to the intelligence they'd gathered during their surveillance of Torino's meeting with Brad's crew. Friday evening's planned arson at the senior center wasn't just insurance fraud. It was also the deadline for Marcus to cease his investigation or watch additional innocent people die. A detective arrived to take Dorothy's statement, but his questions carried the perfunctory tone of someone going through motions rather than conducting serious investigation. When Dorothy mentioned the attacker's specific threats about investigators, the detective's expression shifted to the carefully neutral mask of someone who'd been instructed to avoid certain lines of inquiry. Gang violence, the detective concluded, after 15 minutes of superficial questions. Random crime, unfortunately common in this neighborhood. We'll do what we can, but without witnesses or evidence. The systematic dismissal of obvious criminal conspiracy spoke to corruption extending through every level of law enforcement. Kevin's brutal beating would disappear into statistical categories, while his attackers operated with the confidence of men protected by official indifference. Standing over Kevin's unconscious form, Seagal made a quiet promise that carried the weight of decades spent fighting injustice. This ends now. No more innocent people get hurt while we gather evidence. It's time for direct action. The investigation phase was over. Justice would be delivered personally, immediately, and with the kind of finality that ensured no other families would suffer Dorothy Chen's nightmare. Chapter 15. The next evening, Seagal and Marcus prepared for their most dangerous mission yet, infiltrating Iron Paradise Jim's office during another clandestine meeting between Brad's crew and their political protector. The intelligence they'd gathered the previous night had revealed plans for mass murder, but they needed additional evidence to understand the full scope of the conspiracy and identify all participants. Using Seagal's extensive law enforcement background and Marcus's military training, they executed a textbook covert entry through the gym's ventilation system. The building's older construction provided access routes that newer facilities would have sealed, allowing them to position surveillance equipment in Brad's office without triggering alarm systems. Hidden in the storage closet that doubled as Brad's primitive filing system, they recorded every word of the meeting using professional surveillance equipment Marcus had acquired during his Army CID service. The conversation revealed corruption, extending far beyond anything they'd previously imagined. Insurance adjuster confirmed. Torino's voice carried clearly through their recording devices. Electrical fire, outdated wiring, unfortunate but predictable accident. Payout estimated at $2.7 million, minus standard processing fees. The clinical discussion of mass murder for profit demonstrated how thoroughly evil had infected every level of the conspiracy. Torino spoke about burning elderly residents alive with the casual detachment of someone discussing quarterly earnings. Projections. Fire inspectors report already prepared, Brad added, his voice carrying the confidence of someone operating with complete official protection. Captain Rodriguez confirms his arson investigators will classify the incident as accidental. Electrical failure. No criminal investigation anticipated. The systematic preparation for murder revealed a network of corruption that included insurance adjusters, fire inspectors, police captains, and city officials. The planned arson wasn't just about killing witnesses. It was about generating massive profits while ensuring no official investigation would threaten the participants. Judge Morrison provides legal cover if complications arise. Torino continued, discussing backup plans with the thoroughness of someone who'd orchestrated similar operations before. Any civil lawsuits will be dismissed for lack of evidence. Families will receive standard accident settlements, nothing more. The conversation revealed that Friday night's planned fire wasn't their first venture into mass murder for profit. The casual references to previous accidents and electrical failures suggested a pattern of killing elderly residents while collecting insurance money, all protected by a network of corrupt officials who treated human life as acceptable business. Expense. Seagal photographed documents scattered across Brad's desk, while Marcus continued recording conversations that would provide federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. The paperwork revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise: property purchases, insurance policies, and systematic targeting of buildings housing elderly residents who couldn't afford private security or political connections. Timeline. Confirmed. Torino announced as the meeting neared its conclusion. Friday evening, 8:15 p.m., during peak bingo attendance. Electrical surge, outdated wiring, tragic but predictable accident. Expected casualties, 43 to 57 elderly residents. The numbers were delivered with accounting precision, as if human lives were merely statistical variables in profit calculations. The planned arson would eliminate not just potential witnesses to their extortion schemes, but also generate millions in insurance payouts while removing a population segment these monsters viewed as economically burdensome. As the meeting concluded, and participants prepared to leave, Seagal and Marcus maintained their concealment while processing the magnitude of what they discovered. The evidence they gathered would dismantle the entire conspiracy, but only if they could survive long enough to deliver it to honest federal authorities. Phase 2 implementation begins tomorrow. Torino's final words carried the weight of a death sentence for dozens of innocent elderly residents. No complications, no witnesses, no survivors. They successfully extracted from the building, with recordings and photographs that would ensure life sentences for everyone involved, but the timeline left no room for official channels or proper legal procedures. 48 hours remained until mass murder disguised as accidental fire would claim the lives of people whose only crime was growing old in a neighborhood targeted by monsters. Back at Marcus's house at 2 a.m., they listened to the recorded conversations, with growing horror as the full scope of the conspiracy revealed itself. The quality of their surveillance equipment had captured every word, every laugh, every casual reference to mass murder that demonstrated how thoroughly these criminals had abandoned basic humanity. 43 to 57 casualties, Marcus repeated numbly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just learned that his Friday night bingo friends were targeted for systematic execution. They're talking about burning alive people I've known for years. Helen Martinez, who brings homemade cookies. Frank Peterson, who served in Korea. Margaret O'Brien, who volunteers at the Children's Hospital. The names and faces transformed. Statistical projections into personal tragedy, making the planned arson an attack on specific individuals whose lives had meaning and value beyond their killer's profit calculations. Marcus's voice broke as he considered the systematic nature of the evil they'd uncovered. Seagal studied the recordings and photographs with professional detachment, but his dark eyes reflected fury that decades of experience hadn't diminished. The evidence they'd gathered would ensure federal prosecutions and life sentences, but only if they could prevent Friday night's massacre and survive long enough to deliver justice through proper channels. The timeline is impossible, Marcus said grimly, studying his watch and calculating the hours remaining until mass murder. 18 hours to prevent wholesale slaughter with no trustworthy authorities to contact and a network of corruption that extends through every level of city government. The recordings had revealed the true scope of official protection. Police captains, fire inspectors, judges, and insurance adjusters all coordinating to ensure that mass murder appeared accidental while generating maximum profit for the participants. Approaching any local authority would trigger warnings that might accelerate the timeline or change the target to something even more devastating. Many of the people who attend Friday night bingo have been quietly supporting my investigation. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the guilt of someone who'd inadvertently painted targets on innocent backs. They provided testimony, photographs, witness statements about the extortion. Now they're going to die because they tried to help. The systematic targeting of elderly witnesses demonstrated the thoroughness with which their enemies had planned not just mass murder, but the elimination of anyone who might provide evidence about their broader criminal enterprise. Friday nights. Fire would serve multiple purposes: insurance fraud, witness elimination, and terror demonstration for any other potential resistors. As they planned their response to prevent catastrophe, Marcus received a call that completed their trap. Dorothy. Chin's voice trembled with terror as she delivered the final piece of their enemy's strategy. They moved Kevin to private hospital, she whispered into the phone. They say if you contact anyone, police, FBI, anyone, they kill him and burn down store with me inside. Bingo game Friday night, they say. That their deadline. Stop investigation. Or people die. The message was clear and comprehensive. Act against the conspiracy and innocent hostages would be executed. Don't act and dozens of elderly residents would burn alive in a building fire designed to appear accidental. Their enemies had constructed a perfect trap where any response would result in innocent deaths. We can't save everyone through official channels, Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades making impossible choices in situations where all options led to tragedy. But we can ensure that no innocent people die while guilty ones escape justice. The investigation phase was complete. The evidence phase was finished. Friday night was 18 hours away, and justice would have to be delivered personally, immediately, and with the kind of finality that ensured monsters disguised as businessmen and public servants would never again threaten innocent lives. The final battle was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Dozens of elderly residents whose only crime was aging in a neighborhood targeted by predators who viewed human life as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of profit. Friday morning arrived with deceptive tranquility, autumn sunlight streaming through Marcus's kitchen windows, as if the day held nothing more threatening than grocery shopping and afternoon naps. But both men understood that the next 14 hours would determine whether dozens of innocent elderly residents lived to see Saturday morning or perished in flames designed to appear accidental. With 12 hours until the bingo game that would serve as cover for mass murder, Seagal and Marcus implemented their desperate two-pronged strategy. Marcus would evacuate Sunset Manor Senior Center under official pretenses, while Seagal prepared to neutralize the arsonists at their source, a plan that required split-second timing and absolute commitment to preventing innocent casualties. Remember, Seagal said as they prepared to separate, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades coordinating life-or-death operations. If this goes wrong, if they realize what we're doing, they'll accelerate the timeline. Kevin dies, Dorothy dies, and 43 elderly people burn alive while we're still trying to save them. Marcus nodded grimly, his military training providing the discipline necessary to function under pressure that would paralyze civilian minds. His role required convincing bureaucratic authorities to evacuate a building based on fabricated evidence while maintaining the appearance of routine safety procedures rather than emergency response. At 10 a.m., Marcus arrived at Sunset Manor Senior Center, where preparation for the evening bingo game was already underway. The community room buzzed with the cheerful activity of elderly volunteers arranging tables, testing microphones, and setting up the refreshment station that would transform into a death trap once Brad's crew arrived with their gasoline and electrical accelerants. Janet Powell, the center's director, greeted Marcus with the warm efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years managing the complex needs of aging populations. Her kind face reflected genuine concern when Marcus presented his fabricated story about potential gas leaks detected during routine city inspections. Gas leak, Janet repeated, her administrative mind immediately calculating liability issues and evacuation procedures. The city inspector didn't mention anything during last month's safety review. Marcus drew upon his military bearing and investigative credentials to project the authority necessary to convince someone trained to question unusual requests. New detection equipment identified potential issues with underground lines feeding the building. Could be nothing, but city liability requires temporary evacuation until comprehensive testing confirms safety. The fabrication required careful balance, serious enough to justify evacuation, but not so alarming as to trigger emergency protocols that might alert corrupt city officials to their activities. Marcus needed Janet to view this as routine safety procedure rather than life-or-death emergency response. How long? Janet asked, already mentally reorganizing schedules and notifying residents about disrupted plans. 24 to 48 hours, Marcus replied, hoping that time frame would provide sufficient buffer to prevent any residents from returning before Brad's crew could be permanently neutralized. Better safe than sorry when dealing with elderly populations and potential gas exposure. The evacuation proceeded with the methodical efficiency that Marcus had hoped for, but as residents began filing out with their walkers and wheelchairs, he noticed suspicious vehicles positioning themselves around the building's perimeter. Danny and Rick sat in a black sedan across the street, their telephoto cameras documenting everyone who left the building. The trap was more sophisticated than they'd realized. Brad's crew was conducting surveillance to ensure their targets remained inside for the evening's planned massacre, which meant the evacuation was being monitored and potentially compromised in real time. Marcus's cell phone buzzed with an incoming call that would transform their carefully planned operation into something far more dangerous and immediate. The call came from City Councilman Torino himself, his political authority cutting through Marcus's evacuation efforts like a blade through silk. Janet Powell's expression shifted from cooperation to confusion as she answered the phone call that would unravel their desperate rescue mission. "Mr. Williams?" Torino's voice carried through the phone's speaker with the smooth authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "I understand you filed a false gas leak report that's disrupting city operations and frightening elderly residents unnecessarily." The political intervention arrived with devastating timing. Exactly 6 hours before the planned arson, just as the evacuation was gaining momentum, and precisely when residents were most vulnerable to official reassurances that would lure them back into the death trap being prepared for evening implementation. Janet's administrative training reasserted itself as she faced conflicting authorities, Marcus's safety concerns versus a city councilman's direct contradiction of those warnings. Her 20 years of experience managing elderly populations had taught her to err on the side of caution, but political pressure carried weight that civilian concerns couldn't match. "The fire department has confirmed no gas leaks detected," Torino continued, his voice projecting the reasonable authority that had made him effective at manipulating bureaucratic systems. "This appears to be either a false alarm filed by an individual experiencing stress-related paranoia or possibly a deliberate attempt to disrupt city services." The character assassination was delivered with political precision, transforming Marcus from concerned community member into unstable troublemaker whose warnings should be dismissed rather than investigated. Torino's corruption provided perfect cover for discrediting any efforts to protect his intended victims. As confused residents reluctantly began returning to the building under official reassurance, Marcus found himself trapped in an impossible situation. 43 elderly people were walking back into a building that would become their funeral pyre in less than 6 hours, while he stood helpless to prevent their deaths without revealing the source of his intelligence. "Marcus," Janet's voice, carried the careful tone of someone trying to manage what appeared to be a mental health crisis. "Perhaps you should go home and rest. This has been stressful for everyone, and maybe you're seeing threats that aren't really there." The systematic dismissal of his warnings echoed every victim complaint that had been ignored throughout the months of neighborhood extortion. Marcus's age, race, and economic status made his concerns easy to dismiss when contradicted by official authority, regardless of his military background or investigative credentials. Meanwhile, Seagal conducted his own reconnaissance of the gym and Brad's crew, identifying weapons, vehicles, and planned approach routes for the evening's operation. His surveillance revealed a coordinated plan involving at least 8 men, multiple vehicles filled with accelerants, and electronic equipment designed to trigger electrical fires that would appear accidental to investigators. Marcus used his cell phone to warn Seagal about the evacuation's failure. "They're here early. Buildings surrounded. I count at least 8 men with containers of accelerant." Torino intervened directly. "Residents are going back inside." The timeline had collapsed completely. Instead of 12 hours to prepare defensive positions and coordinate responses, they now faced immediate implementation of mass murder while 43 elderly residents settled in for their weekly bingo game, unaware that their building was surrounded by men carrying the tools of their destruction. "Buildings compromised," Marcus continued, his military training providing tactical assessment despite the emotional trauma of watching friends walk unknowingly toward their deaths. "Multiple exit points blocked from outside. They're not planning to let anyone escape once the fire starts. As smoke began rising from the building's foundation, accelerants being positioned around structural supports and electrical systems, Marcus realized he wasn't just facing the failure of their rescue mission. He was trapped inside a building designed to become a crematorium, along with 6 elderly residents who'd refused evacuation and now faced the same horrible death their attackers had planned for the entire community. Dorothy Chun stood beside him, having arrived for bingo despite her grandson's hospitalization and her own terror about the threats she'd received. Her presence transformed the situation from tactical failure into personal nightmare. The woman whose suffering had started his investigation was now facing death beside him, while her attackers prepared to eliminate all witnesses to their months of criminal enterprise. Seagal arrived at Sunset Manor Senior Center to find the building already engulfed in flames that climbed the exterior walls with unnatural speed, fed by accelerants that had been strategically placed to ensure rapid structural collapse. The orange glow against the evening sky created an apocalyptic scene that spoke to the systematic nature of the evil being implemented. His rental car screamed into the parking lot as fire trucks, controlled by corrupt officials, maintained their delayed response, arriving just late enough to ensure maximum casualties while maintaining plausible deniability about their deliberately inadequate emergency services. The coordination spoke to planning that extended far beyond street-level criminality into institutional murder. Through the smoke and flames, Seagal could see figures trapped on the second floor, Marcus and 6 elderly residents who'd either refused evacuation or been prevented from leaving by the arsonists now positioned around the building's perimeter. Emergency exits had been quietly blocked from outside, creating a death trap designed to ensure no witnesses survived to provide testimony about the evening's true nature. Seagal's most heroic moment began as he charged into the burning building, despite the overwhelming odds against successful rescue. Using his environmental awareness and decades of physical conditioning, he navigated thick smoke and growing flames to reach the second floor, where desperate voices called for help from behind doors blocked by fallen debris. The rescue sequence showcased every aspect of Seagal's legendary capabilities. Carrying 89-year-old Harold Martinez down a smoke-filled staircase required not just physical strength, but the tactical awareness to navigate around falling ceiling tiles and structural supports weakened by deliberately set fires. Each step was calculated, each movement precise, as he balanced speed against safety while racing against time and structural collapse. Patricia Williams, wheelchair-bound and terrified, required different rescue techniques as Seagal literally lifted her chair over fallen beams and through doorways partially blocked by debris. His conditioning allowed him to maintain strength and focus despite smoke inhalation that would have incapacitated younger men, proving that experience and technique could overcome physical limitations imposed by age. Dorothy Chin's rescue proved particularly challenging as her small frame and limited mobility required careful handling while navigating obstacles that grew more dangerous with each passing minute. Seagal's protective instincts, honed through decades of defending the innocent, drove him to make multiple trips into the inferno despite the growing danger of complete structural collapse. Each rescue was a race against time as the fire spread with the unnatural speed of professionally applied accelerants. Danny and Rick had positioned themselves around the building's perimeter, claiming to be helping with evacuation while actually ensuring no one escaped alive. Their presence added the threat of direct violence to the environmental dangers of smoke and flame. "Get away from the building," Danny shouted with false concern as Seagal emerged with another elderly resident. "It's not safe. Let the professionals handle this." But Seagal's trained eye recognized the subtle positioning that blocked escape routes while maintaining the appearance of helpful assistance. These men weren't trying to save lives. They were ensuring that their planned massacre proceeded without unwanted survivors who might provide inconvenient testimony about the evening's true nature. The environmental challenges grew more severe with each rescue mission. Smoke obscured vision, heat intensified beyond human endurance, and the structural integrity of the building deteriorated rapidly under the assault of strategically placed accelerants. Yet Seagal continued his systematic extraction of every endangered life, proving that heroism had no expiration date. As he prepared for his final trip into the building to rescue Marcus and the last remaining elderly resident, Rick stepped forward. With a crowbar, his cruel intelligence finally recognizing that their carefully planned mass murder was being systematically dismantled by a single man whose commitment to protecting innocents exceeded their dedication to profit and destruction. The battle between good and evil was about to become personal, immediate, and absolutely final. With all elderly residents safely evacuated despite the arsonist's attempts to prevent rescue, Seagal faced his ultimate confrontation in the apocalyptic setting of the burning senior center. The building had become a hellscape of flames, smoke, and collapsing structures, the perfect arena for a final battle between justice and the monsters who preyed upon society's most vulnerable members. Danny attacked first, swinging his crowbar with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully planned mass murder had been systematically dismantled. The weapon whistled through smoke-filled air, but Seagal's superior positioning and environmental awareness turned the confined space into a tactical advantage rather than limitation. Using the smoke as concealment, Seagal redirected Danny's violent swing into a support beam with enough force to jar the crowbar from his hands while sending vibrations through his steroid-enhanced arms. The confined hallway prevented Danny from using his size advantage, while falling debris created obstacles that favored superior technique over brute strength. The battle moved through multiple rooms as the fire spread with increasing intensity, each environment presenting unique challenges that Seagal turned to his advantage. In the kitchen, hot coffee became a projectile weapon while pots and pans served as both shields and bludgeons. Rick's knife work, so effective against helpless elderly victims, proved useless against an opponent who could read attacks before they fully developed. "You should have minded your own business, old man," Rick snarled as he lunged with his blade. But his cruel intelligence had never faced someone who understood violence as both art and necessity. Seagal's response demonstrated the difference between technique and desperation. Rick's knife thrust was intercepted, redirected, and turned against him as the smaller man found himself disarmed and unconscious in the industrial sink, his switchblade quickness no match for decades of refined martial arts mastery. The confrontation with Brad occurred in the main hall where the fire had started, surrounded by flames and falling debris that created an arena worthy of their final battle. The gym owner's steroid-enhanced physique and confidence in his physical superiority dissolved when faced with an opponent whose reputation was built on destroying bullies exactly like him. "This is my neighborhood," Brad shouted, pulling a gun as his desperation reached its peak. "These people were my business. You had no right to interfere." The weapon represented his final admission that strength and intimidation had failed, leaving only the tool of cowards who couldn't win through skill or courage. But as Brad aimed the pistol through the smoke and chaos, a ceiling beam crashed down between them, knocking the gun away and forcing him into the hand-to-hand combat, where Seagal's superiority would be absolute. "Your business was terrorizing innocent people," Seagal replied calmly, his voice carrying over the roar of flames as he advanced with predatory grace. "That makes it my business to stop you." The final fight showcased every principle of aikido, as Seagal systematically dismantled Brad's aggression and redirected it into self-destruction. Every punch Brad threw was turned against him, every grab became a throw, and every attempt to escape led to greater entanglement with superior technique. The burning building became part of the combat, as Seagal used falling debris to block Brad's attacks, redirected his opponent into flames when he became too aggressive, and finally applied a precise joint lock that rendered the gym owner helpless while sirens wailed outside and the roof began its final collapse. "This is for Marcus," Seagal said quietly as he maintained the submission hold. "For Dorothy. For Kevin. For every elderly person who was afraid to leave their house because of you." Brad's consciousness faded as honest firefighters finally arrived to replace the corrupt officials who delayed response to ensure maximum casualties. Seagal carried the unconscious arsonist from the building just as the structure reached complete collapse, but he understood that the physical threat was only half resolved. The corrupt system that had enabled mass murder still needed to be dismantled, and justice would require more than defeating street-level criminals. Brad's gun lay buried beneath fallen debris, forcing him into the hand-to-hand combat where his steroid-enhanced arrogance would meet its final reckoning. The gym owner who'd built his reputation terrorizing the elderly and vulnerable now faced a legend whose life's work involved dismantling bullies exactly like him. Even surrounded by flames and collapsing structures, Seagal's aikido principles remained absolute. Brad's desperate punches were redirected with surgical precision, his grabbing attempts transformed into throws that sent him crashing into burning debris. Every technique demonstrated the fundamental truth that had guided Seagal's career. Superior skill and moral purpose would always triumph over brute force and evil intent. "You destroyed lives for profit," Seagal said calmly as he applied a wrist control technique that dropped Brad to his knees among the burning wreckage. Terrorized elderly people who'd earned respect through decades of honest living. Planned to murder innocent residents for insurance money. The burning building provided a fitting arena for justice as Seagal systematically countered every desperate attack Brad launched. The gym owner's size and strength, so effective against helpless victims, became liabilities when facing someone who could turn aggression into self-destruction through pure technique. Brad's steroid-fueled rage proved useless as Seagal used the environment itself as a weapon. Falling ceiling tiles became shields. Broken furniture transformed into obstacles that trapped his opponent's movements, and the smoke-filled air provided concealment that favored experience over desperation. "I built an empire," Brad screamed, his voice cracking with the realization that his carefully constructed criminal network was collapsing around him. "These people owed me respect. I gave them protection." "You gave them terror," Seagal replied, applying an irimi Nage throw that sent Brad sprawling across the burning floor. Protection rackets that bled businesses dry. Threats against grandmothers and college students. Mass murder disguised as electrical accidents. The final exchange demonstrated the gulf between authentic martial arts mastery and the crude violence that had made Brad successful against defenseless victims. His wild swings met empty air, while Seagal's precise counters found their marks with mathematical certainty. A joint lock applied with perfect leverage rendered Brad's struggles useless, as Seagal maintained control despite the chaos surrounding them. The submission technique showcased decades of refinement, enough pressure to ensure compliance without causing permanent damage, even to someone who'd planned to burn dozens of elderly people alive. "This is for every innocent person you terrorized," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "For Marcus, who served his country honorably. For Dorothy, who built a life through honest work. For Kevin, beaten unconscious because he helped his grandmother. For every elderly resident who feared leaving their home because of your threats." As honest firefighters finally arrived, federal agents having replaced the corrupt local officials, Seagal prepared to carry his unconscious opponent from the collapsing building. But Brad's defeat was only the beginning of justice, not its conclusion. The systematic corruption that had enabled mass murder required dismantling at every level, from street criminals to the political figures who'd provided protection in exchange for profit. The physical battle was ending, but the war against institutional evil was just beginning. Seagal lifted Brad's unconscious form as the roof began its final collapse, but his mind was already focused on ensuring that every participant in the conspiracy faced consequences proportional to their crimes. 3 days after the senior center fire, federal agents swarmed through the city like antibodies attacking infection, their coordinated investigation dismantling corruption networks that had operated with impunity for years. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos established her command center in the federal building, surrounded by evidence that Seagal and Marcus had risked their lives to gather. "Systematic conspiracy," Agent Santos announced as she briefed the federal task force assigned to prosecute the case. "Extortion, arson, attempted mass murder, and corruption extending through multiple city departments." The recordings from Torino's gym meetings provided irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy's scope and deadly intent. Video footage of money exchanges, audio recordings of murder planning, and financial documentation revealed a criminal network that had generated over $2 million through systematic terrorism of elderly and minority residents. Seagal's law enforcement connections proved crucial in ensuring the evidence reached honest federal authorities rather than disappearing into the local bureaucratic black hole that had protected the criminals for months. His decades of experience navigating institutional corruption provided the expertise necessary to bypass compromised officials and deliver justice through proper channels. Councilman Torino arrested at his home this morning. Agent Santos continued, displaying photographs of the political figure being led away in handcuffs. Charges include conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, insurance fraud, and corruption of public officials. The coordinated arrests swept through every level of the conspiracy like a cleansing fire. Police Captain Rodriguez, Fire Inspector Mitchell, and Judge Morrison found themselves facing federal charges that would ensure life sentences if convicted. Their network of protection had become evidence of their guilt, each corrupt official's involvement documented through the systematic intelligence gathering that Marcus and Seagal had conducted. Brad Kellerman and his crew face federal murder conspiracy charges, Agent Santos announced with satisfaction. Danny Kowalski and Rick Martinez arrested without incident. All three defendants held without bail pending trial. The street-level criminals who terrorized the neighborhood for months discovered that federal prosecution operated under different rules than the local system they corrupted. No political connections could influence federal judges, no bribes could affect FBI investigations, and no intimidation tactics could reach witnesses under federal protection. Dorothy Chin's testimony, delivered from Kevin's hospital bedside where the young man was finally showing signs of recovery, provided crucial evidence about the systematic intimidation campaign. Her courage in speaking truth to federal authority demonstrated the power of justice when honest institutions protected honest citizens. 12 businesses confirmed as extortion victims, Agent Santos continued, reading from a comprehensive list that Marcus's investigation had made possible. Total illegal payments exceed $200,000, with systematic targeting of elderly and minority residents. The financial analysis revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise while providing evidence for asset forfeiture that would ensure victims received compensation for their losses. Every dollar extracted through terror would be returned to the community that had suffered under systematic predation. Marcus visited Kevin in the hospital where the young man had finally regained consciousness after his brutal beating. The college student's recovery represented more than medical success. It symbolized the community's healing as the criminal network that had terrorized them faced inevitable justice. "Is it over, Mr. Williams?" Kevin asked weakly, his voice carrying the hope of someone who'd paid a terrible price for his family's courage in seeking help. "It's over, son," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice delivered after months of systematic injustice. "They can't hurt anyone anymore." The federal investigation continued expanding as additional victims found courage to come forward, but the immediate threat had been eliminated. The neighborhood that had lived in fear could finally begin healing from months of systematic terrorism. 6 months later, spring sunlight streamed through the windows of what had once been Iron Paradise Gym, now transformed into the Eleanor Williams Community Center. The dedication plaque near the entrance honored Marcus's late wife, while acknowledging the courage required to stand against systematic evil when official institutions failed to protect innocent citizens. The transformation was complete and symbolic. Where Brad Kellerman had once orchestrated harassment and extortion, elderly residents now gathered for fitness classes designed specifically for their needs and limitations. The weight machines that had witnessed intimidation now served seniors, rebuilding strength and confidence after months of living in fear. Marcus managed the community center with the same methodical efficiency he'd applied to his military service and criminal investigation. His office walls displayed photographs of neighborhood residents whose lives had been restored through the elimination of their tormentors, business owners whose shops now thrived without extortion payments, elderly couples who could again walk evening streets without fear. Dorothy Chin's convenience store had expanded to include a small cafe where neighborhood residents gathered to share coffee and conversation. The addition represented more than business growth. It symbolized community, bonds that had been strengthened rather than broken by their shared experience of surviving systematic terrorism. Mrs. Chun never misses her morning walk now, Marcus told visitors who came to understand how ordinary citizens had defeated organized crime through courage and mutual support. 6 months ago, she was afraid to leave her store. Now she organizes. Neighborhood watch meetings. Kevin Chun, fully recovered from his injuries, worked as Marcus's assistant while completing his college degree part-time. His presence served as living proof that evil could be defeated without destroying the innocent lives it targeted. The young man's recovery had become a symbol of hope for other victims who'd suffered violence for seeking justice. The gym equipment had been supplemented with amenities that reflected the center's true purpose. Comfortable chairs for senior discussion groups, large print books for weekly reading circles, and tables for the Friday evening bingo games that now drew participants. From across the city, what had been planned as a site of mass murder had become a celebration of community resilience. "We hold the weekly bingo game in the main hall," Marcus explained to federal agents who visited to document the investigation's positive outcomes. Same night, same time as when they planned to burn everyone alive. But now it's about bringing people together instead of destroying them. The irony was deliberate and healing. Friday evenings that had been marked for mass murder now represented the community's strongest expression of unity and mutual support. Elderly residents who'd been targeted for elimination gathered weekly to celebrate their survival and continued vitality. Wall displays throughout the center documented the investigation and prosecution that had restored safety to the neighborhood. Photographs showed the federal arrests. Newspaper articles detailed the sentences that would keep the criminals imprisoned for life, and testimonials from victims described their recovery from systematic terrorism. The strongest thing about this place, Marcus reflected as he prepared to lock up after another successful day, is that we didn't just survive what they tried to do to us. We became stronger because of it. As evening approached, Marcus paused. At the memorial photograph of Eleanor in the lobby, her image watched over the community center that bore her name, a fitting tribute to someone who'd taught her husband that dignity and courage could triumph over any form of evil. "We did it, baby," he whispered to her photograph. "We made our corner of the world a little bit better." Seagal prepared to leave the city as quietly as he'd arrived, his simple belongings packed into the rental car that had carried him through weeks of investigation and confrontation. His work was complete. Justice had been delivered, corruption had been exposed, and innocent lives had been protected from systematic evil. Marcus approached for their final conversation as elderly residents walked confidently through streets they'd once feared. The transformation was visible in every aspect of neighborhood life. Businesses thriving without extortion payments, families gathering in parks without concern for their safety, and elderly couples enjoying evening walks that had been impossible during months of systematic terrorism. "I thought I was too old," Marcus reflected as they stood outside the community center that had replaced the gym where their partnership began. "That my best days were behind me, that I couldn't make a difference anymore. You showed me that experience and wisdom are their own kind of strength." Seagal's response carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades learning that heroism had no expiration date. The strongest warrior is one who protects those who cannot protect themselves. Age doesn't diminish that responsibility, it deepens it. You had the courage to investigate when others would have accepted injustice. You had the wisdom to gather evidence when others would have sought revenge. You had the strength to stand up when it mattered most. Their handshake carried the weight of shared danger and mutual respect. Two men separated by background and experience had found common purpose in protecting the innocent from systematic predation. Their partnership had proven that ordinary citizens could defeat organized crime through courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. Dorothy Chun waved from her store window, her smile reflecting the security that came from knowing her neighborhood was safe. Kevin helped an elderly customer with groceries, his recovery complete and his future secure. The Friday evening bingo crowd began arriving at the community center, their weekly gathering now a celebration of survival rather than a target for mass murder. "You gave us back our lives," Marcus said simply. "Our dignity, our safety, our hope for the future. How do you thank someone for something like that?" "You don't thank me," Seagal replied, his voice carrying the humility of someone who understood that true heroism sought no recognition. "You keep doing what you're doing. You keep protecting your community, helping your neighbors, and proving that good people can make a difference when they stand together." As Seagal drove away into the evening sunset, the neighborhood behind him buzzed with the normal activities of people living without fear. Children played in parks that had been unsafe for months. Elderly couples shared evening walks that terrorism had made impossible, and small businesses flourished without the burden of extortion payments. Marcus began preparing for another evening of community service, his calendar filled with activities that brought neighbors together rather than driving them apart. The community center's success had attracted federal funding for additional programs, job training for young people, health services for elderly residents, and educational opportunities that strengthened social bonds. The final image was of transformation complete, not just the removal of evil, but the presence of people willing to build something better in its place. A neighborhood that had been terrorized by systematic predation had become stronger through the experience of standing together against organized corruption. Seagal continued toward whatever destination required his particular combination of skill, experience, and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. Somewhere, other communities faced similar threats from those who preyed upon the vulnerable. Somewhere, other heroes were needed to remind the world that age and wisdom could triumph over youth and arrogance when guided by courage and moral purpose. The legend drove into the sunset, ready for wherever justice called him next, while behind him a community continued the daily work of proving that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary evil through the simple act of refusing to surrender their dignity to those who trafficked in fear and violence. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.